Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Epic Tomorrows, or if you are watching this on Arkbound Media, welcome to the channel. It is now my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Kate Booth and Tristan Sykes, the co-founders and coordinators of Just Collapse. Quoting from their website, Just Collapse is an activist platform dedicated to socio-ecological justice in face of inevitable and irreversible global collapse. Just Collapse advocates for a just collapse and a planned collapse to avert the worst outcomes that will follow an otherwise unplanned reactive collapse. Just Collapse recognizes that there will be no justice in an unplanned collapse. Dr. Kate Booth is an activist academic at the University of Tasmania and a senior lecturer in human geography in the School of Geography, Planning and Spatial Sciences. Tristan Sykes founded the Tasmania branches of Extinction Rebellion and Occupy, and is currently the coordinator of Free Assange Australia. But tell me if that's still not the case. I just realised I got that from a year-old.
No, that's still the case.
Okay, great, fantastic. So first of all, welcome to both of you. It's really great to have you on my little channel. And to begin with, could you give a brief history of how Just Collapse came about?
Well, Just Collapse took solid form in 2021, but I guess the longer history of it is that Tristan and I both independently have been collapse aware for decades, since quite a relatively young age, for different reasons. I had a very environmental, I guess, upbringing, focus on ecology in my upbringing, and I read Jared Diamond in my 20s, The Collapse book, and I realized that's the trajectory we're on, unless something changed dramatically, and it hasn't changed dramatically. It got worse.
I suppose through high school history studying, I ran across Ehrlich and Paul Ehrlich's work on the population bomb, and I started exploring that, but it didn't really. It sort of really intuitively hit me, rather than any sort of rather than a single body of work. But if I was to summarize what the most influential source, I would say Limits to Growth was the really I suppose the tone that I would direct people towards.
Yeah. And we've both done activism of various kinds throughout our lives, and it after doing some time in Extinction Rebellion, a lot of things weren't making sense, weren't adding up anymore. We had lots of conversations during the pandemic lockdowns,
Yeah,
and Just Collapse was born.
great, fantastic. Yeah, I've had a strange journey with Extinction Rebellion too. I started out really eager, and obviously there's a lot of good that came from the movement, but ultimately I think strategically they're way off now and not focusing on what needs to be focused on. It's interesting you mentioned Limits to Growth, because a couple of years back I read I think it was it the 40-year update to Limits to Growth or something like that. And I kind of agreed with I mean, I'm a complete amateur, but the way the predicament was explained resonated with me, but the kind of remedies that he was suggesting didn't. He seemed to be.
Oh, are you talking about Guy Harrington's work, or
No, Jorgen.
Oh,
yeah.
Yes.
Quite. He seemed to have quite a. I don't know. He said that everyone should move to the cities and stuff like that, and I wasn't really sure about that, and that we shouldn't. And even saying things like we should educate our children that they're not going to see nature anymore, and they should get used to seeing it on a TV screen and stuff like this. I thought it was a bit strange. But yeah, anyway, important work, Limits to Growth, obviously. So, okay, great. Next question. I know this is explained thoroughly in your online material, and we're all aware here, but for the sake of our viewers, could you briefly explain in your own words why focusing on the climate crisis won't solve the climate crisis and won't prevent widespread socio-ecological collapse?
So the predicament we face, the root of it is overshoot, ecological overshoot, and that is basically using and abusing the earth more than the earth can sustain, replenish, absorb. And CO2 is part of that pollution of CO2 that comes from burning fossil fuels, one of the, the major greenhouse gas. But it's not the whole crisis, because overshoot includes microplastics, it includes biodiversity loss, all forms of pollution and burning up finite resources.
Yeah, so there's been a misidentification of what the problem actually is, and it's a wicked problem, what they call a predicament. And unfortunately, the nature of predicaments is that they can't be solved. They can be responded to, but they can't be solved. And that is the predicament before us as we face what some call multi-crisis, polycrisis, and all of everything crisis. We just call it collapse, but there are just so many aspects, and to focus on this one pollution issue leads to all kinds of maladaptive, inverted commas, solutions, like having a mining boom so that we can build everything out as renewable. That's and it can be, on various issues, a really canny political strategy to focus on one dimension, bite that off and run with it. And that's basically what most of the climate movement has done. They've bit off CO2 and they're running with that as the issue that needs to be addressed. But under this particular set of circumstances, that is a fatally flawed strategy for a range of reasons, including what Tristan just articulated. And it's really convenient to power, which can then set up organizations like the IPCC, and then use that organization to maintain infinite growth on a finite planet by alternate means, or by addressing this one issue of overshoot rather than addressing the full predicament as it exists. It allows them to.
Sure. There's a question. There's a question mark for me over whether the so-called mass renewables transition would, apart from all the horrible mining and destruction of biodiversity and everything, and destruction of human communities, whether it would even create more CO2 emissions anyway. Do you know anything about that? Like the amount of manufacturing involved?
Yeah, there's some work by Associate Professor Simon Michel, which goes into some degree of the quantities of, and his assessment is that we don't actually have the quantity of mineral resources in order to actually make this transition. What we would be transitioning to would be infinitely smaller, but it would be much smaller, a much smaller energy system, or we would try to, and it would also be infinitely more complex, because the nature of the energy supply is very different. It's not as versatile and easy to use as the direct power that comes from fossil fuels. So it's important to recognize the diesel and smelting processes with coking coal are used all through the stages, as well as the transportation of all of this inverted commas renewable energy.
Yeah, we basically need a hyper growth for a period to build out everything. So when people say electrifying everything, what they're making a case for is hyper growth and hyper extraction, hyper production, hyper pollution.
Right. Because otherwise, I mean, I'm not great at understanding economics. I'm learning, but any other way would necessitate a shrinking of the capitalist system. Wouldn't be able to carry on, would it? If it was a transition to a much smaller system, that although that's desirable on one level, economically that wouldn't work within capitalism, would it, to transition to a smaller?
No, it would be collapse. And I've read at least one
collapse, yeah.
example of, there was a reduction in water use in a major city in Europe, and I'm not even sure it was intentional, but perhaps it was a shrinking population or a change in demographics, and the water infrastructure was all built for a particular capacity, and because the capacity shrank, the infrastructure wouldn't function anymore. So it basically meant a rebuild of the water infrastructure so it would function for a lower capacity. So that's concrete, that's manufacturing, that's transportation.
And intuitively, some of this just makes sense in that, if you shrink down, say, a car, you take the distributor cap off and a couple of wheels, well, the car doesn't go anymore.
Right.
It's when you've got a very complex system,
Yeah,
and then you start pulling bits out of it.
yeah, that's a good analogy. I'll have to think about that. Yeah,